In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of the human race. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God, whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, or the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only begotten Son, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, 'He who comes after me ranks ahead of me, because he was before me.' From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only begotten Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known." The Gospel of the Lord.
This morning on this wonderful feast day and solemnity that we celebrate, first aspect is just to express to you on behalf of all the staff and especially Father Sean the joy and the peace of this Christmas season and especially this day itself, and a prayer that we all share with each other today gathered in the church, that what we celebrate today and the wonderful mystery that we celebrate today will reside deep within our hearts and inspire us not just during this day with its joy and its comfort, but also throughout this Christmas season and going forward in our lives. And we also keep in mind so many people who are unable to celebrate this feast day, some because of lack of faith or from scandal, or especially those who are prohibited from celebrating this because of political difficulties or because of war or displacement or homelessness or so many things, so many refugees throughout the world. And today is a day we pray especially for peace that we always have to pray for, but on this day, the birth of the Prince of Peace himself among us, it's a prayer that is really an obligation given to us to join together with so many, but also pray for those who suffer so terribly in these days in so many places that we see in the newspapers and on the television news and whatever. But many other places that aren't so well known where people suffer, and we keep in mind today. But the joy that we are given to us today is not to be dampened by the miseries of things and the difficulties of the world. Those things are put in their context. But our task today is to be joyful and to be comforted by the Lord and the great gift that he gives to us. The testimony of what we celebrate today is given to us in our readings. And our first example is from St. Paul's letter to the Romans. And in writing this letter, as so many times, Paul tries to encapsulate in just a few little words, just the kernel of what we believe, the importance of what is given, because words were precious for him in writing these letters, and he didn't have the time, as he had previously, to sit down with people over a period of a year or so and catechize them and bring Christ to them and evangelize them. But now he reminds them of things, and he sends quick little letters, things that are rich in the mystery of the faith that we celebrate. And he opens this wonderful letter by speaking of the fact that God has spoken to his people, and that in itself is a great joy for us. God isn't some distant God, but he is one who communicates with his people. And Paul understands this because of his intimate relationship with God. And he knows that God spoke in the ages past in varied and different ways, and sometimes veiled ways through prophets and through the law and what happened with the holy people God had called to himself in a covenant that he had made with the people. But now, Paul says, he speaks to us through his Son, a Son born among us and a Son who walked the world and spoke to us. And Paul, who never met Christ in the flesh, had that remarkable encounter with the risen Lord on the road to Damascus, which changed his life completely. Our second testimony is from St. John, the one who is called by the Lord, the one who is present in so many aspects of the Lord's life, from his transfiguration to hearing the words to being the very end at the foot of the cross. John takes upon himself, but the Lord gives to him a very special calling of reflecting over years in the mystery of what he has experienced and his present relationship with the risen Lord. And he writes to us one of the most precious letters and the most precious gospels that we have. And what we read today and proclaim to us today is the beginning of that gospel, in which he then too in a hymn puts forward the fundamentals of our faith. The word that the Lord spoke, the word that was God himself, that was from the very beginning. God himself was born and became flesh and lived among us. And this becomes the whole faith that John speaks to us, not just in this prologue that we read today, but all the gospel, in all the stories and all the sayings of Jesus, which he has reflected upon for decades before he writes these things down. And we can see the wonderful gift that the Lord gives to us in an expression of the faith of John, but the faith of the church, which Jesus has transmitted to the world. What is it that we believe? Just what we explained, and the simplicity of that, of the child born today is consubstantial with the Father and consubstantial with us, with his mother. Fully divine, fully human, not a mixture of the two, but in a mysterious way, God born among us in the fullness of humanity. And this is not something that our minds figure out or the wisdom of this age figures out for us. This is something that is given to us by the Father himself, who draws us to him and gives us a faith which is given to us often through other people in our lives, in our parents, or the testimony of our friends. But then the task becomes for us to make this precious faith something that is preserved within us and then also strengthened day after day. And the church and ourselves are drawn to this celebration because it marks so much of the nature of what we believe, that the Christ born at Bethlehem, born in humility, is God himself and lives among us for a specific reason, which fulfills God's plan from the beginning of time, before all ages, even before our fall and before the nature in which we live. To bring us back to the Lord, to bring us back to God himself, all the souls that God has created to be with Christ for eternity. And this is what we celebrate. It's a great joy for us, something beyond our comprehension, but given to us in these messages, in the testimony of our faith, but the faith of Paul and of John today, that enlivens us, and then we start to realize the nature of this child who is born. That plan of salvation, that plan of giving joy and comfort to the people, makes itself manifest in a unique way, in ways that we would never expect, in the humility, absolute humility of Bethlehem. And in this crib scene that we have, we see and contemplate the very humility and the degree to which God goes to the depths to capture all of humanity within the salvation of his fishing net, whatever, and brings all of us back to himself. But the degree of that humility, of that abasement within himself, that emptying of himself, is the sign of the great love that God has for us, that he would go this far for our salvation, for our comfort, for the joy that we celebrate today, and for our salvation in time. Our third testimony is St. Francis. We spoke of this last night at the Midnight Mass, because last night and today, but last night we celebrated and marked the 800th anniversary from the night that St. Francis celebrated Midnight Mass and instituted the crib scene, or the creche, or the presepio, which is so dear to us. And he did it for a reason. He did it in this wonderful small town of Greccio on his way back to Assisi, and he did this for his own sake. And he didn't do it just for the entertainment of the people there, or to put on a show so people could be enlivened by something. But he did it so that he could enter into the mystery of the humility of Christ. He created a scene visible to his eyes, which corresponded precisely to what Paul speaks of in the letter to the Romans, precisely what John reflects upon and gives to us in this wonderful deep contemplation of the nature of God himself. And Francis, the poor one, who is striving always to take away the things within himself, his ego, his pride, his intellect, all the things that he knows from experience, have hindered him from being a disciple of Christ. And one thing that he does is create something visible before him, so that he can celebrate and he can pick up the child Jesus present in this devotional scene for himself and for the people of the town of Greccio, and for all of us now, that we can see how much humility is in the God who is born of the Virgin and put in a crib in a manger scene for us. And that's the invitation for us, not to be in front of the crib and pray and just watch it as a participant from a long distance, but be actively participant in it, not a spectator, but one who allows himself to realize, to be a disciple of Christ, this is what I have to do. I have to humble myself to the degree that Christ does, so that I'm in communion with him. And did John understand this? John certainly understood this, because in his gospel he reflected on the washing of the feet that Christ did with all of them, including himself, before he gave his life for us. And when they shuddered and said, "This is something you shouldn't be doing, Lord," he said, "Unless you do this and let me do this for you, you cannot have communion with me." Francis understood that. Francis understood that his life needed to mirror and be called in the example of Christ's life to give to us. And that's our task today, to continue to strive to see, first of all, the gift of God's humility, and second, to strive to follow that example through all the tests and trials and still remaining sins within our lives in which our egoism and our pride continue to come through. And then we pray, as we know that conquering ourselves and the peace of Christ within us, the comfort of Christmas, will spread in the world and will give peace, a true peace, to the world that is among us. Last task I leave with all of us. Be comforted today and be joyful today. The Lord has the power to do that within us, not just ourselves, through our will, but we move our soul to a scene like Christ gives to us today, and St. Francis and the words of these wonderful disciples, and we allow the Lord, but the Lord comforts us when we open our hearts to that. And in the humility first we can move towards Christ. He will give those gifts to us that we can then take to the world and proclaim the birth of the Messiah among us.